The wind over the high plains of Dust Creek carried an unnatural chill that night, the kind of cold that slipped through wool coats and rattled the bones like the whisper of a warning. On the outskirts of Cedar Creek territory, a lone rancher named Elijah Dawes worked his land under a sky stained by the eerie glow of a rising blood moon. The barren hills cast long shadows over his property, and the faint bleating of cattle echoed strangely, as if swallowed by something unseen. Elijah paused while closing the last gate, sensing that he was not alone in the darkness. His horse, a seasoned Mustang named Copper, stomped nervously and snorted toward the ridge. By dawn, Elijah found 3 of his best cattle mutilated in ways he had never seen. Their bodies bore no claw marks, no bites typical of wolves, cougars, or coyotes. Instead, the flesh seemed torn in ragged spirals, as if twisted by hands rather than jaws. Strange tracks surrounded the carcasses, prints shaped like human feet, but wrong in size and angle, as though something walked half-crouched, forcing its weight unnaturally forward. Elijah knelt, fingertips tracing the misshapen impressions, and a shiver ran up his spine. Whatever had done this moved with a purpose beyond simple hunger. He saddled Copper and rode the fence line, scanning the rolling fields and distant buttes for any sign of intruders. Yet every time he thought he spotted movement, just at the corner of his vision, nothing was there. Only the whispering grass and the lonely whistle of the wind greeted him back. Elijah tried to dismiss the unease settling in his chest, telling himself it was exhaustion, the stresses of ranch work, or the strange pull of the blood moon overhead. But deep down, he felt something ancient stirring in the land, something older than the ranch boundaries and older than the town itself. Near sundown, while repairing a broken post along the northern boundary, Elijah heard a sound he could not explain. It began as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it carried a cadence, almost a voice. Then came the howl, not the yip of a coyote or the long call of a grey wolf. This sound was deeper, filled with a sorrowful rage, vibrating through the air like the cry of a creature torn between 2 worlds. Copper reared, nearly throwing Elijah off the saddle. He gripped the reins tightly, trying to calm the horse, while his own pulse thundered in his ears. That night, while the blood moon climbed higher into the starless sky, Elijah lay awake in his cabin, the faint glow seeping through the wooden cracks like red smoke. Every instinct told him to leave the land until the moon waned, but something inside him refused. This ranch was his inheritance, the last piece of his family's legacy. Still, as another howl echoed across the plains, closer this time, almost at the edge of his barn, Elijah realized one truth. Whatever stalked his property was not a simple predator, and its arrival under the blood moon omen meant that this was only the beginning. The next morning, Elijah rode into Cedar Creek with the uneasy weight of the previous night still gripping his chest. The streets were quieter than usual, dust blowing across wooden porches and shuttered windows. As he tied Copper outside the general store, he noticed how folks inside stiffened at the sight of him. Their conversations died mid-sentence, eyes drifting toward the dried blood on his shirt sleeve from examining the mutilated cattle. Elijah tried to shrug it off as coincidence, but the tension in the air felt heavier than the summer heat that settled over the frontier town. Inside the store, Mrs. Aldridge, a stern woman in her 60s, kept her eyes down while counting nails into a small burlap sack. Elijah asked casually if anyone else had lost livestock recently. She froze, fingers tightening around the metal nails until her knuckles whitened. "You should keep to your land, Elijah Dawes," she whispered without looking up. "Some things out there ain't meant to be disturbed." Her voice trembled with something between fear and pity. When he pressed further, she simply shook her head and gestured toward the door as if urging him back into the street. From there, Elijah headed to the saloon, a dim, smoky refuge for cowhands, drifters, and men with secrets. The moment he stepped inside, a musician's guitar went silent. The bartender, polishing a glass, muttered, "Back again, Dawes?" Elijah ordered a coffee instead of whiskey, sat at a corner table, and waited. It didn't take long before an old man with a weathered face, long silver hair, and deep-set eyes approached him. This stranger moved like someone who had lived through storms others never noticed. He sat without invitation, leaned in, and spoke in a gravelly whisper. "You live near Red Hollow Ridge, don't you?" Elijah's breath caught. "My ranch sits at the edge of it." "Why?" The old man's gaze darkened. "Those lands are cursed," he said, fingers drumming the table in a slow, uneasy rhythm. "Long before Cedar Creek was founded, something wandered those hills wrote it off as superstition until the killing started." Elijah leaned closer as the old man continued. "A creature that isn't fully beast nor fully man, a cursed soul trapped between worlds. It hunts families tied to that land. It hunts at night, and it always returns when the moon bleeds." Elijah felt a chill crawl up his arms despite the warm saloon air. Before Elijah could ask more, the saloon doors slammed open from a gust of wind that seemed far too strong for a calm day. The old man's eyes flicked toward the entrance. Then he abruptly stood. "Leave this town tonight," he warned, gripping Elijah's shoulder with surprising strength, "or lock yourself inside your home. The blood moon hasn't finished rising." With that, he limped toward the back exit and vanished into the alley. Elijah remained seated, heart pounding, mind swirling with half-spoken warnings, fearful glances, and the undeniable truth settling in his gut. Whatever stalked his ranch, Cedar Creek already knew, and feared it deeply. Elijah rode back to his ranch as the sun bled out across the horizon, turning the sky into a smear of bruised red and purple. The old man's words from the saloon clung to him like dust. A creature not fully wolf, not fully man, bound to his land by some ancient hatred. As he passed the northern pasture, he saw the half-buried carcasses of the dead cattle, already buzzing with flies despite the cooling air. He dismounted long enough to drag canvas over them, more to keep his own mind from fixating on the sight than to protect the meat. Every time he looked toward the distant ridge, he could almost feel eyes staring back. That evening, Elijah did something he hadn't done since his pa died. He barred the cabin door from the inside. He checked his rifle twice, laid his revolver on the table within easy reach, then lit a single lantern and turned down the wick. Too much light made a man a target, too little made him blind. He settled into a chair by the window, where he could see the yard, the barn, and the dark line of the corral fence. Out over the hills, the blood moon lifted, round and swollen, painting the land in a sickly crimson glow. Hours crawled by. The ticking of the old wall clock became a hammer in his skull. Every creak of the timbers, every distant hoot of an owl, every brush of wind against the cabin boards made his muscles tighten. Around midnight, the cattle grew restless, lowing in panicked bursts that cut off too fast. Elijah rose, steadying his breathing, and moved closer to the window. That was when he heard it. A rustle near the corral, followed by a soft, deliberate scrape like claws on wood. The hairs on his arms stood up. A shadow detached itself from the deeper dark near the barn. At first, Elijah thought it was just a man, tall, hunched, moving on two legs. Then the figure dropped to all fours in a fluid, horrible motion, its back arched, shoulders jutting unnaturally, and its head tilted toward the cabin, ears pricked. Moonlight caught its outline, long limbs, a torso too thick for any natural animal, and a muzzle, there was no other word for it, elongating from a face that might once have been human. Elijah's breath hitched. The stories weren't just campfire talk. This thing was real. The creature moved along the fence, sniffing, testing the boards with a quiet strength that made the wood groan. Once it stood fully upright, towering in the red light, and Elijah saw the gleam of eyes, golden, intelligent, and wounded in some way that went beyond the animal. For a long moment, those eyes fixed on the cabin, and Elijah felt the weight of that gaze penetrate the thin walls, seeking him out. His finger tightened on the rifle trigger, but before he could line up a shot, the werewolf threw back its head and unleashed a howl that tore through the night. a sound of rage and loss tangled together, and then it was gone, vanishing into the hills like a nightmare pulled back into the dark. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and broken. Elijah woke before dawn with the taste of iron in his mouth and the memory of golden eyes burned into his mind. He saddled Copper without breakfast and rode hard for Cedar Creek, dust kicking up behind him like smoke. The people in town watched him pass with a mixture of curiosity and dread, whispering behind hands as he dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. If anyone besides the old man knew what stalked his land, it would be Sheriff Amos Hale. The sheriff was a broad man in his 50s, mustache trimmed neat, badge pinned to his vest like a burden more than a pride. He sat behind a battered desk, leafing through paperwork that looked more like a distraction than duty. When Elijah stepped in, Amos glanced up, gaze sharp enough to cut. "You look like you wrestled something in your sleep and lost," the sheriff said. "What brings you in this early, Dawes?" Elijah closed the door behind him and leaned against it, jaw clenched. "I saw it," he said. "Last night, on my land." The sheriff's eyes hardened, the lines at their corners deepening. "Careful what you claim you saw," Amos warned. "Some things, you say 'em out loud, and they start answering." Elijah stepped forward, palms flat on the desk. "My cattle are dead. My horse damn near threw me. There's something walking on 2 legs and 4, and it knows exactly where I live." His voice dropped. "And folks in this town know more than they're saying." Amos stared at him for a long, heavy moment, then let out a breath that sounded like surrender. He reached down and unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk, pulling out a thick ledger bound in cracked black leather. The edges of its pages were yellowed, corners bent, stains darkening the cover. "This was my predecessor's," Amos said. "Sheriff Caleb Harlan. Man kept 2 sets of books, one for the law, one for the sins this county tried to ignore." He pushed the ledger across the desk. "Read page 87. Elijah flipped through brittle pages filled with cramped handwriting, lists of attacks, disappearances, strange sightings. His finger stopped on the entry marked in darker ink, "Blood Moon Killings." The description made his stomach twist. Livestock torn in spirals, human bodies left in pieces too clean to be claws alone, tracks that blurred between man and beast. "They called it the Ridge Creature," Amos said quietly. "But some wrote down the older name, Loup-Garou, Man of the Moon. Werewolf, if you want the book word." Harlan believed it wasn't just wandering. It hunted bloodlines tied to certain lands. Elijah's eyes drifted down the page until they landed on a name amid a list of targeted families. His own last name stared back at him. "Dawes." "Elijah," Amos continued, voice low, "Harlan thought your people were tied to this curse. Your pa, your grandpa before him. They both saw things they never told you, thought silence was protection." He reached into the drawer again and produced a small, tarnished tin box. Inside lay 6 bullets, their surfaces dull but unmistakably different. "Silver," Amos said. "Harlan had 'em cast special. Said if the creature ever came back, it might be the only way to put it down. He never got the chance to use 'em. You might—" Elijah stared at the bullets, then at the ledger, the room suddenly too small. The curse wasn't just on his land, it was in his blood. Elijah left Cedar Creek with the silver bullets heavy in his pocket and the sheriff's words heavier in his mind. On the ride back, he kept glancing at the hills, as if expecting the creature to crest every ridge. Instead of going straight home, he veered north, toward a place locals called Blood Trail Canyon. Harlan's ledger had mentioned it again and again, a place where tracks always seemed to lead when the killings started, a place from which few hunters returned. If the werewolf had a lair, Elijah intended to find it. The entrance to the canyon yawned between 2 jagged cliffs, their faces striped with red stone like old wounds. As Elijah rode in, the air cooled, shadows stretching long, even though the sun still sat high. The path narrowed, forcing him to dismount and lead Copper by the reins. Strange markings marred the stone walls. Not quite letters, not quite scratches, but something in between, as if claws guided by intention rather than instinct had carved them. Some looked fresh. Others seemed older than the county itself. Halfway down the canyon, Elijah found signs of a struggle. Blood splattered the rock in dark, dried arcs. Tufts of fur lay tangled in thorn bushes, coarse and dark, thicker than any wolf's. A few yards away, he spotted the remains of a small camp, a fire pit ringed by stones, a rusted coffee pot, a shredded bedroll. Someone else had hunted here once, and it hadn't gone well. Elijah knelt to examine the ground and found tracks overlaying each other, boot prints, paw prints, and the now familiar warped human foot shapes of the creature. Near the camp, half buried under a fallen rock, he found a leather satchel stiff with age. Inside lay a waterlogged notebook, its pages warped but legible in places. The writing, shaky but determined, spoke of long nights tracking the moon beast, of a man who believed killing it would free his family from a curse passed down generations. The last entry ended mid-sentence, ink smeared as if the writer's hand had been jerked away. Elijah looked up from the notebook to the canyon walls, feeling suddenly very watched. A low growl rolled through the narrow pass, echoing off the stone. It wasn't far. Copper's ears went flat, the horse snorting and tugging against the reins. Elijah rose slowly, sliding his rifle from his shoulder, the silver bullet heavy in the chamber. The growl came again, closer this time, mingled with the scrape of something large moving over rock. Shadows shifted near an outcropping ahead, and Elijah caught a glimpse of black fur and a flash of gold eyes. The creature was here, in the canyon with him, boxed in by stone. As the blood moon began to climb again over the ridge, Elijah realized this hunt would not wait for him to be ready. Elijah backed out of Blood Trail Canyon with every nerve screaming, resisting the urge to fire blindly into the shadows. The creature followed him in sound but not in sight, growls echoing, claws scraping, the occasional stone tumbling as if nudged. Yet it never lunged, never showed itself fully. It was herding him, he realized, pushing him out. It wanted him elsewhere. That thought chilled him as much as any direct attack. By the time he reached open ground and mounted Copper, the blood moon had climbed higher, and a storm gathered on the horizon. He raced home under a sky roiling with dark clouds. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by slow, heavy thunder. Rain began to spit by the time he saw his ranch house, the barn looming behind it like a silent sentinel. The cattle were bunched near the fence, uneasy, some pacing along the boards. Elijah dismounted before the porch, scanning the yard. Everything looked as it should, until he noticed the barn doors. He was sure he'd latched them before going to town, yet now one stood slightly ajar, rocking gently with each gust of wind. The rain intensified, drumming on the roof and turning the yard into slick mud. Elijah approached the barn quietly, rifle cradled, every sense stretched thin. The air near the doors smelled wrong, like wet fur and copper and something wild. Thunder cracked overhead as he nudged the door wider with the barrel of his gun. The dim lantern he kept inside still burned, casting long, shaky shadows over hay bales, stalls, and hanging tools. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then a shape shifted near the back stall. The creature rose from where it had been crouched among hay and broken crates. Up close, it was worse than the silhouette from the night before. A hulking mass of muscle and fur, long arms ending in hands tipped with curved claws, shoulders so broad they nearly brushed the rafters. Its head was a grotesque fusion of wolf and man, jaws bristling with teeth, ears pricked and twitching. It snarled, saliva glistening, then paused as its nose worked the air. Slowly it turned toward Elijah, and he saw recognition in its eyes, not the recognition of prey, something else. The werewolf lunged. Elijah fired. The crack of the rifle merged with a crash of thunder, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. The silver bullet struck the creature's side, just below the rib cage. It howled in agony, a sound that nearly drove Elijah to his knees. The beast staggered, clutching at the wound with its clawed hand, and for an instant its features rippled. The muzzle shortened, the fur along its face thinned. Amid the monstrous visage, Elijah glimpsed something terribly human, a familiar line of jaw, a scar cutting through one eyebrow, eyes he knew from another life, another time. His stomach lurched. "No," he whispered. The creature growled, eyes blazing with a mix of pain and fury that felt like betrayal. Then it crashed through the side of the barn, wood exploding outward, and vanished into the storm, leaving behind torn boards, splattered blood, and Elijah standing in the wreckage, heart hammering. The face he'd seen under the fur haunted him more than the claws or teeth. It was a face he hadn't seen in years, a face he believed buried 3 towns over, the face of his younger brother, Jonah Dawes. Rain lashed the ranch for hours, turning the fields into rivers and washing away tracks almost as soon as they formed. Elijah worked through the night, boarding up the barn wall, moving the cattle closer to the house, and watching the hills between lightning flashes. He kept seeing Jonah's face in every shadow. Jonah, the wild one. Jonah, who had run off with a pack of drifters after a brutal argument with their pa. Jonah, who Elijah had been told was shot in a border skirmish years ago, dead and buried. Yet the scar through that half-transformed eyebrow, it could not be coincidence. By dawn, the storm had spent itself. The world smelled of wet earth and lingering fear. Elijah took a canteen, a coil of rope, his rifle, and the sheriff's silver bullets and headed into the hills behind the ranch. If Jonah was the creature, then there was still a man inside that monster, and Elijah would not let someone else put him down like an animal without knowing the truth. The blood moon would rise again that night. Time was running out. He followed faint traces, the occasional bloody handprint on a rock, a tuft of dark fur snagged on a thorn, deeper footprints where something heavy had stumbled. The trail led to a clearing tucked between rocky outcroppings, a place he and Jonah had run to as boys whenever Pa was in one of his tempers. Elijah recognized the crooked cedar tree on the edge, the fallen log they'd once balanced on. It looked smaller now, or maybe he had just grown. He stepped into the open space, cautiously, rifle at the ready. The air felt thick, as if the land itself were holding its breath. "Jonah," he called. The name tasted strange after so many silent years. "If that's you, you come out. I ain't letting the town be the first to find you." For a while, there was nothing. Then a man stepped from the shadow of the cedar tree. Not a beast, a man. He was leaner than Elijah remembered, his clothes torn and stained with dried blood. His hair hung in damp strands around his face, and his eyes, once bright with mischief, now held a haunted, hollow look. The scar over his eyebrow was exactly where Elijah had seen it on the creature. His hands trembled, the fingers too long, nails darkened as if stained by something that wasn't quite dirt. "You always did follow tracks better than me," Jonah said hoarsely. "Guess some things don't change." Anger, relief, and terror collided in Elijah's chest. "I saw you," he said, "in my barn. Don't tell me I imagined that. Don't tell me this is just you running from trouble again." Jonah's jaw worked. "I wish I could," he replied. "I wish I could say I just drank too much, picked the wrong fight, and needed a place to lay low. But you know better. You saw better." He lifted his hands, palms up, showing scars that ran in jagged lines down to his wrists. Bite marks, half healed, half festered. "I got bit down near the border. Thought it'd kill me. Guess it did. Just not the way I expected." Elijah raised the rifle, but the weight of it felt wrong. "You been killing my cattle," he said. "God knows what else. Town's seen this before. Sheriff's got a ledger full of bodies." Jonah nodded slowly, shame twisting his features. "I don't remember the worst of it," he said. "It's like falling into a well. I feel the moon come up, bones break, skin tear. Then it's all teeth and hunger till the sun drags me back up. I wake up covered in blood I can't explain. I came back to this land 'cause something in me pulled me here, like a rope tied to my guts." He met Elijah's eyes. "It's the Dawes blood, Eli. Whatever this curse is, our family's standing right on top of it." Elijah's finger twitched on the trigger, torn between love and duty, between the silver in his pocket and the brother in front of him. "There has to be a way to end it," he said through clenched teeth. "Sheriff's ledger, the old hunter's notes, they talked about ways. Rituals, crossroads, silver, something more than just shooting you through the heart and hoping that's enough. Jonah let out a bitter laugh. You always were the one looking for a clean solution, he said. But you're talking about wrestling with something older than both of us, older than Cedar Creek. You sure you want to drag yourself into that well with me? Elijah lowered the rifle a fraction. I ain't letting you drown alone, he replied. Back in the cabin, Elijah spread out everything he had on the rough-hewn table: Sheriff Harlan's ledger, the dead hunter's notebook from Blood Trail Canyon, Amos Hale's handful of silver bullets, and the scrap of an old letter Elijah had found among his father's things years ago, a letter that mentioned the door's debt to the moon, in lines he had once dismissed as drunken poetry. Jonah sat at the far end of the room, hunched, pale, eyes half closed, as if listening to something only he could hear. Outside, the sky dimmed, the day slipping toward another blood-soaked night. The notebooks spoke of a ritual, pieced together from frontier hearsay and older tales. A crossroads under the open sky where four paths met. Silver buried at each point, blessed or cursed by words whispered in languages the writers didn't fully understand. Blood of the beast and blood of the one who claimed it as kin spilled into the dirt, a choice offered to whatever power oversaw the curse. Claim the beast entirely, or break the line by mercy or fire. None of the accounts agreed on the outcome. Some ended with freedom, others with madness. Many simply ended. There's a crossroads out past the creek, Elijah said, tracing a rough map on the table with his finger. Used to be where cattle trails split. Dirt there's been turned by more hooves than I can count. If there's any place this land remembers decisions being made, it's there. Jonah watched him, jaw tight. You're talking about standing in the open under a blood moon and inviting whatever's in me to step out and shake hands, he said. You sure you're ready to see that? Elijah met his gaze. I've already seen you tear my barn apart, he answered. This time, we do it with a plan. As twilight deepened, they rode together to the crossroads, two brothers side by side, as they had once ridden to market as boys, though the air between them now crackled with dread instead of easy laughter. Elijah carried a shovel, a small tin of salt, the silver bullets, and a knife. Jonah carried only himself, which was, Elijah knew, more dangerous than any weapon. At the crossroads, where four paths carved into the dust met in a rough X, they dismounted. Elijah marked each of the 4 points with small holes, burying a silver bullet at every corner, covering them with dirt and sprinkling salt over each mound. As the blood moon lifted, the world took on that strange red tint again, shadows deepening, sounds sharpening. Jonah began to tremble, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling air. It's coming, he gasped. Bones are itching already. Elijah drew the knife and, without giving himself time to hesitate, sliced his palm. Blood welled, dark in the ruddy light. He let it drip into the center of the crossroads. Jonah stared, then held out his own hand. Elijah cut him too, their blood mixing in the dust. The air grew thick, humming, not with electricity, but with something older, a presence settling over them like a cloak. Elijah spoke the words he'd pieced together from the journals, half in English, half in fragmented phrases from older tongues. He asked for the curse to be pulled from the door's blood, for the beast to be given a choice, leave or be bound, end or continue. The wind rose, spinning dust around them, forming a small, furious storm. Jonah cried out as his back bowed, bones popping, fingers twisting. The change was coming faster than before, like the land itself was pulling it out. Elijah reached for his brother, but an unseen force shoved him back, hard. In the center of the crossroads, Jonah dropped to his knees, half human, half beast, caught in the agony of transformation as the blood moon flared brighter above. Whatever had heard Elijah's plea was answering, but not yet revealing whether mercy or ruin would be its reply. The ritual did not end the curse. It twisted it. Jonah's body contorted, fur rippling along his spine, claws tearing grooves into the dirt, but his eyes, Those tortured, familiar eyes remained strangely human even as his jaw lengthened and teeth sharpened. He stared at Elijah, trapped between man and monster, and Elijah felt the weight of a terrible realization. The crossroads had not freed Jonah. It had forced the man to stay awake inside the beast. The howl that tore from Jonah's throat was raw, layered, part wolf's rage, part human scream. A gust of unnatural wind knocked Elijah to one knee. When he looked up, the werewolf, no longer fully Jonah, but not fully lost, bolted, muscles coiling as it launched itself toward the distant hills. It didn't run like a mindless predator. It ran like something fleeing a decision too awful to face. Elijah staggered to his feet, wiping blood from his face where flying grit had cut him. The knife, slick with both their blood, lay at the crossroads center. He picked it up, then reached into his coat for the rifle rounds, fingers closing around the last 3 silver bullets. He could have let Jonah go, could have ridden the other way, left the town to its fate, the curse to its cycle. But Cass's voice, their mothers, the ranch hands, the old hunters' scribbled words, seemed to whisper from every stone and scrap of paper he carried. It ends with you, with your choice, with your shot. Elijah loaded the rifle with deliberate, shaking hands, then swung into Copper's saddle and spurred the horse after the fleeing shape. The blood moon watched from overhead, a crimson eye bearing witness. The chase carried them over rocky hills and through dry creek beds, past dead trees and scattered boulders that cast long, clawed shadows. Elijah caught glimpses of the beast ahead, dark fur flashing, limbs blurring, moving with both animal speed and a human's desperate aimlessness. It wasn't heading for the town. It was heading toward Blood Trail Canyon, toward the place where so many hunters' trails had ended. Elijah understood, and then Jonah was running toward the heart of the curse. Whether to end it or to hide in it until the moon waned, Elijah couldn't tell. At the canyon's mouth, the werewolf stopped and turned. It stood tall, chest heaving, eyes glowing gold and human-sad all at once. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, 2 Dawes men and the sum of everything their bloodline had carried into this land. Elijah dismounted slowly, rifle in hand, boots crunching on gravel. "Jonah," he called, voice raw, "if you're in there, hear me. This is our last chance. I can't keep you from killing, can't keep them from hunting you. I can only choose how this ends." The wind tugged at his coat, carried away his words, but he kept speaking anyway. The creature's head tilted, its lips pulled back, but the sound that came out wasn't a snarl. It was something broken, like a word caught between a growl and a sob. Elijah raised the rifle, tears blurring his vision. He didn't aim for the heart, not exactly. He aimed for the place where man and beast met, where the ritual had left Jonah awake in his own nightmare. He took a breath that tasted of iron and dust, whispered a goodbye only he could hear, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked like judgment, echoing off the canyon walls. Silver flew, and time held its breath. The bullet struck. The werewolf staggered back, claws clutching at its chest. Light, not moonlight, not lantern light, something stranger, burst from the wound in crackling threads, running along its veins like lightning. Jonah's form shuddered, warping between shapes, fur receding, returning, bones snapping and reforming in ways that made Elijah's stomach twist. The howl that rose from his brother's throat climbed higher and higher until it wasn't a beast's cry at all, but a man's raw, agonized shout. Then, slowly, the sound ebbed. When the glow faded, Jonah lay on the canyon floor, human, bare-chested, skin pale and slick with sweat and blood. The scar over his eyebrow was there. The bite marks along his hands and forearms, though dulled, remained. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Elijah dropped to his knees beside him, rifle forgotten. "Jonah!" he whispered. His brother's eyes fluttered open, the gold washed from them, leaving only a tired, familiar brown. "You always were a lousy shot," Jonah rasped with a faint, fading grin. "Could have ended it quick. Instead you did something else." Elijah swallowed hard. "Did it work?" he asked. "Is the curse gone?" Jonah's gaze drifted to the sky, where the blood moon had begun to lower toward the horizon, its color fading toward a bruised purple. "I don't hear it anymore," Jonah said quietly. "That hunger, that pull, feels like someone cut a rope inside me." He grimaced as pain rippled through his body. "But I don't think I'm walking out of this canyon, Eli. Silver does what it does. You just aimed it at the part of me that was wrong." Tears slid down Elijah's face unchecked, cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "I should have done more," he said. "Found a better ritual, found a way to save you without—" Jonah shook his head weakly. "You did what no one else ever tried," he whispered. "You faced it, faced me. Harlan ran from it. Pa pretended it didn't exist. You stood in front of the worst of it with a rifle in your hands and love in your heart. That's more mercy than a monster like me deserved." He coughed, blood staining his lips. "Make sure it ends with me. Don't let this land claim anyone else with our name." As the first pale streaks of dawn crept into the sky, washing away the last of the blood moon's glow, Jonah's breath slowed. His grip on Elijah's sleeve loosened. Elijah stayed there, holding his brother's hand until the warmth bled from it and the canyon fell silent. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled once, long and low, then stopped. It sounded less like a threat now, more like a farewell. Elijah closed Jonah's eyes and sat back on his heels, feeling as if something enormous had shifted in the world, even if the canyon still looked the same. He buried Jonah on a rise overlooking the ranch, under a lone cottonwood tree that had stubbornly clung to life through drought and storm. No cross, no carved stone, just the land, a mound of earth, and a small silver bullet casing pressed into the soil at the foot of the grave. When he rode into Cedar Creek later that morning, the town already knew something had changed. The air felt lighter. People moved without flinching at every sound. Sheriff Amos Hale listened to Elijah's account without interrupting, then quietly wrote one final entry in Harlan's ledger. "Curse on Dawes Line ended by blood and silver." Life in Cedar Creek and on the Dawes Ranch did not turn suddenly easy. Cattle still died of sickness. Fences still broke. Storms still blew in from nowhere. But the mutilations stopped. The unnatural howls under the blood moon became a memory, a story told in the saloon to wide-eyed drifters who laughed until they saw the way the locals fell silent and glanced toward the hills. Elijah worked his land with a new heaviness in his shoulders and a new clarity in his eyes. He knew now that some monsters wore fur and claws, and some wore boots and badges, but the worst of them thrived in silence. On certain nights, when the moon rose full and bright but no longer blood-red, Elijah would sit on the porch, hat tipped back, listening. Sometimes he heard nothing but the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. Other times, he thought he heard a familiar laugh riding the breeze from the direction of Jonah's grave, or saw a darker shape sitting under the cottonwood tree, shoulders relaxed, watching the ranch with more peace than Jonah had ever known in life. He never went closer, never called out. Some goodbyes were better left at a distance. One evening, years later, a new ranch hand asked him if the stories about the Dawes werewolf were true. Elijah considered his answer carefully. The boy had the same mixture of fear and fascination he'd once seen in his own eyes, staring at shadows that seemed too big. "We had a sickness here once," Elijah said, "in our blood and in our land. It hurt a lot of people before it was done. So long as we remember what it cost to end it." He looked toward the fading line of Blood Trail Canyon. "Monsters don't just appear. We make room for them, and we can choose to stop." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but the seed had been planted. On the rare nights when clouds slid over the moon and turned the sky the color of old bruises, Elijah sometimes thought he heard a howl rise from the far hills. It never came closer. It never lingered. Just a single, sharp note, like a reminder that the line between man and beast was thinner than most cared to admit. He would tip his hat toward the sound and murmur, "Rest easy, Jonah." Then he'd go back inside, lock the door out of habit more than fear, and trust that the worst of the curse lay buried under cottonwood roots and canyon stone, where even the blood moon could only look down and remember.